True Crime Brewery contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Medical information is opinion based on facts of a crime and should not be interpreted as medical advice or treatment. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to True Crime Brewery. I'm Jill.
And I'm Dick.
After Jimmy Don Beets' fishing boat was found abandoned in Lake Athens, Texas, the locals speculated that he had accidentally drowned. But then 2 years later, his body was found buried in a wishing well on his own property. And, shockingly, another missing man was discovered entombed on the same property. These two men had one thing in common, and that was Betty Lou Beets. Join us at the quiet end for Down the Wishing Well. The story of the life of Betty Lou Beets has a continuous thread of hardship and dysfunction running through it that most of us can't imagine. But does a difficult past excuse dishonest, cruel, and violent behavior? That's up for debate. But even Betty's children, who survived years with her, would be shocked by her hard-heartedness.
So here we are in Texas for these murders. We're going to drink some Lone Star, which I drank a fair amount of in my younger days when we lived in Oklahoma. And, it's not a very good beer, but it's kind of the state beer for Texas. It's an American adjunct lager, so it's sort of in the Budweiser category. Clear yellow color, tiny white head, aroma, not too much, some sweet grain, a little bit of grassy hops. Taste, also not much, some corn, a little hop bitterness. It is refreshing. So's water.
Okay, so similar.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a nice enough beer to drink. I think the other beer I drank a good amount of back in the day is Pearl. So I might review that sometime, too, when we have another Texas case.
Okay, because we do have a lot of Texas cases.
Yeah, Texas seems to be a popular murder spot.
It really does. Okay, well, let's open it up. Okay, come on down to the quiet end. Now, when I was reading about this case, it's from quite a while back, but I just found a lot of things really remarkable about it. So, I was thinking a lot about the past of the killer and the different psychological aspects of the case and the relationships with the people. So it is really fascinating, I think.
Though Betty Lou was the second child of James and Louise Dunavant. Her life began in a cramped cabin that had no electricity, no running water. The family survived on flour, cornmeal, and salt pork. They rarely had any fresh fruit or vegetables. So Betty and her older brother Dewey were almost always hungry. They lived in this kind of a shack, so they were hot in the summer and cold in the winter. They didn't even have glass in their window frames. Their only source of heat was a black coal stove, which may have kept the tiny cabin warm, if not for the fact that there were no windows. They were either all broken or missing.
Now that's horrible. I can't imagine living like that.
I don't see how you could.
Well, you have to, apparently.
You have to live in a temperate enough climate so it doesn't get too cold or too hot, but still.
Oh, I think it got pretty fucking hot.
Yeah.
Yeah. But they were sharecroppers.
Yeah, they lived in Roxborough, which was a village in the plains of North Carolina, in the heart of tobacco-growing country. Betty Lou was born at a time when the population of about 5,000 was still trying to recover from the Great Depression. Poverty was a nearly universal plight in Roxborough, and Betty Lou's young, uneducated parents struggled to make a living as sharecroppers on a tobacco farm.
They did struggle, but they did make quite an effort, it seemed. In the winters, when the tobacco crops had been harvested, Betty's mom Louise even took a second job as domestic help. So she cleaned the homes of wealthy people, and she'd come home each night to the family cabin and describe the mansions to Betty, sharing every detail. And Betty's mother promised her that their lives would improve. To try and make this a reality, Louise and James packed up their scant belongings and they moved 20 miles north to Danville, Virginia, which was an industrial town on the border between Virginia and North Carolina. So there, Betty's parents worked in the cotton mills and put the children in the company daycare center. And the children had more of life's necessities then. They had some comforts even in Danville. The family rented out a nice little house that stayed warm in the winter, and they could afford more fresh food. So the health of the family improved, but it still wasn't perfect. Now I can imagine you're going and cleaning these mansions and then coming home to a little cabin. That would be really frustrating.
Oh.
It'd be really disheartening. You're working so hard, and you're coming home to a shack.
Yeah, but they were able to get out of there. They got into a fairly decent little home.
They did. But despite all those improvements, Betty was frequently ill as a child. She was a frail little thing with blonde hair and blue eyes. She had waxy pale skin and looked pretty unhealthy in a lot of her childhood pictures. Betty had the measles, chronic sore throats, coughs, and fevers. So her mother had to take time off from work to care for her. Then, after many sleepless nights with Betty's high fevers, her parents worried all the time that they would lose her. Ear infections left her with some hearing loss, and after she recovered and returned to school, she had a really hard time hearing her teacher. So learning was more difficult, and she started to feel really disconnected from her peers. She wasn't included.
No, Betty had to repeat 4th grade. Now this was pretty humiliating for Betty, when her former classmates saw her in the halls and knew she was still in the 4th grade. And they teased her. They called her stupid. When Betty was 8 years old, her mother gave birth to another son, Jimmy. Then 2 years later, another daughter was born, and this was Jackie. 4 years after Jackie's birth, when Betty was just 14, her mother had what doctors called a psychotic break with reality. And this is while she was working in the mill. The mill called an ambulance to rush Louise to a hospital, and she stayed there for a week. When she returned home, she was not the same person. She had become timid and anxious. And she was on psychiatric medications, still suffered from hallucinations and hearing voices. And seemingly out of nowhere, she'd become hysterical, waving her arms in the air to shoo away demons only she could see. So
that's really sad.
She schizophrenic or something?
Well, it sounds like it, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Well, over the next year or so, Louise's mental illness became even worse, and she was ultimately institutionalized at Eastern State Hospital in Virginia for 3 full months. The public psychiatric hospital treated her with shock therapy, and she had 17 rounds of deep insulin coma therapy. Now, you've heard of that.
Yeah.
What does that do?
Well, you're given insulin, so you get hypoglycemic, and you pass out from the low blood sugar.
So how's that supposed to help with mental illness?
Well, good point. It's thought that by doing it, you're kind of resetting the system.
So kind of the same thing that shock therapy would do.
Yeah.
Well, she's really lucky she didn't end up with a lobotomy, because during that time, that happened.
Well, yeah.
Yeah. So Betty's classmates all heard about her mother's mental problems. And when they saw Betty in the halls, they weren't kind to her at all. They actually would fake seizures and do impressions of a madwoman, making fun of her mother. So this was brutal, and Betty felt that she was stupid and maybe she was crazy too. So for Betty, school became unbearable to the point where she'd just do anything to get away. She just wanted to get out of there, and it's very sad what she went through.
Yeah, it was tough times.
It was difficult. It wasn't just at school, at home. Things were tough, as you can imagine.
Yeah. Now, as the oldest girl, her mother's former chores fell to Betty. She hated cooking and cleaning for the family, and her weight dropped to 80 pounds. Sometimes she was too exhausted to even go to school, so she fell further behind academically. And then adding to these problems was how her father was dealing with his wife's condition.
Well, he wasn't really dealing with it at all.
Well, he began to drink heavily.
Yeah.
So he was self-medicating his own depression. Betty would cringe every time she saw him remove his belt, because she knew he'd be beating her with the buckle.
Ugh.
And after the beatings, Betty obeyed. She learned to accept that she would be beaten, and she dreamed constantly of the day she could escape.
Well, who wouldn't, really? This is a very difficult thing.
You'd be saying, if I can survive till whatever.
Right. And she didn't even make it to 18. She did escape when she was 15. What happened is she fell for a handsome 18-year-old. His name was Robert Branson. Branson, with brown eyes, dark hair, and olive skin, was a quiet young man, and he had a job in a zipper factory. So he was a few years older. Betty had not yet had her first period when she started seeing him, but her mother Louise thought that Betty could be pregnant. So she encouraged her to marry Branson, even though Betty insisted that she was still a virgin. But Betty went ahead and she married him just 1 month after she completed the 9th grade. So she was a child.
15.
Yeah.
And married. Already it would seem to me that you're jumping out of the frying pan into the fire type of thing.
Well, yeah, and, obviously she was too young to realize what was happening there, but she soon would.
Yeah.
It didn't end her problems.
Oh, no.
She had a child 1 year after she got married, and that was Faye, a little girl. But instead of being happy to be married and have this new baby, Betty started to feel like she'd traded in one difficult life for another. She complained to her husband that she was no better off with him than she had been in her parents' home. And having a new baby was really no different than being saddled with her younger siblings. So she did not really escape that life. She just created her own.
Right. So hoping that more money would make Betty's life easier, Robert went to the Norfolk shipyard and took a better paying job. When he started working there, he had hoped that Betty's attitude would improve. But he still came home every evening to a bitter, angry woman who just wanted to escape. She often ran into former classmates who would brag about their proms and other teenage activities that Betty was missing out on. Betty wasn't really sure about what she wanted from life, but she was sure that what she had wasn't it.
Absolutely. So while Robert and Betty were separated for 6 months, Betty and her daughter went to stay with her parents. And being there, Betty just fell into a deep, deep depression. Now she's not only in that situation, she's got a baby with her in that situation. So she ended up attempting suicide by swallowing 2 full bottles of aspirin. Her parents called Robert and told him about this attempt, and he rushed right over and talked her into getting back together. He was still in love with her.
She did go to the hospital, right?
I don't know. Maybe not. These people did not really go to the hospital or the doctor.
2 full bottles of aspirin could easily kill her.
Well, I know. Maybe she threw them up. I don't really know if she went to the hospital.
Something had to happen because she lived.
She lived, and Robert was still in love with her and talked her into coming back.
Yeah, and then the next year, Betty's second daughter, Connie, was born. The Bransons wanted a new start, and Robert learned that he could make more money in a construction job in Texas. So they packed up their belongings, and they and their 2 young daughters moved to Mesquite, a small town that's southeast of Dallas. They rented a small house where Betty settled into being a full-time mom.
So one thing that strikes me here is, did Betty ever really want to be a mom? It doesn't seem like it. It seems like the situation and the times just made her think that that's all she could do.
Yeah.
Was just get married and keep having babies.
I think that's it.
And I think with every baby, things got a little bit worse because she really did not want to be a mom. In Texas, a 3rd daughter, Shirley, was born. And then 3 years later, a 4th daughter, Phyllis, was born. But it didn't end there. Then they had 2 sons 2 years apart, Robbie and Bobby. So they're married for 14 years, and Robert and Betty had a total of 6 children. Betty was only 29 when she had all these kids. But she still looked great. She was still very pretty. She was good at choosing clothes that accentuated her hourglass figure. She had a tiny waist and large breasts, and she wore a full face of makeup and high heels, almost like a Dolly Parton type look. She bleached her hair and permed it, and she liked to get dressed up, go out, and have a good time. But she was spending all day taking care of 6 children, and that certainly was not her idea of fun. She began to crave the attention of men, and she found that she could get that by just hanging out at the local bars. And she got a lot of positive attention from the men.
Yeah, Betty would have her older daughters babysit her young sons, and she drove herself to the Silver Slipper, and that was a popular bar in East Dallas. She went in by herself as music played loudly from the jukebox. The men all watched her with admiring glances, and some would ask her to join them at the table. They laughed at her jokes, and they asked why a pretty young thing like her was out on her own. Betty loved the attention as the men took turns dancing with her, holding her, and showering her with compliments. At last, she felt that she had found the fun she had missed in her teenage years. But, over time, Betty's party life away from home became the subject of daily arguments with her husband.
Well, you can imagine he wouldn't like it.
Well, yeah. "Bye, honey, I'm going out to the bar." And she's all dressed up. Can only imagine what he's thinking.
Well, I mean, she's really just living her adolescence that she never had.
Yeah.
But it's not going to work out because she's the mother of 6 children and she's married.
Yeah.
You know, even the children became annoyed by her new focus, and she was really having this growing disinterest in her home and her family, which was pretty sad, difficult for the kids for sure. But Robert did try to work on the marriage. He understood that she was young, but it was too late. Betty had already checked out emotionally. And Robert, still handsome and fit, had plenty of women who were interested in him. So in 1969, after they'd been married for 17 years, Robert demanded a divorce from Betty, and she didn't really want it. But he went ahead and married a younger woman shortly after the divorce was final. Betty was given full custody of the children, and Robert was ordered to pay child support to her. And this kind of broke Betty's heart. Even though she was going out and getting this attention, I think she was in love with Robert still, at least in the way that she could be. She kept a framed photo of Robert on a table in the living room, and she cried to her children about how she still loved their father and she missed him so much. The children thought that their mother never seemed happy with anyone else after that. After the divorce, they weren't together for Christmases or Thanksgivings. There were no more Easter egg hunts at their paternal grandparents' house. So the children were painfully aware of how their parents' divorce had really changed their lives for the worse.
Yeah, and Betty found life without a husband to be way more difficult than she had imagined. This life had many hardships, especially when Robert didn't pay the court-ordered child support on time. So to forget about her problems, she spent more nights out, and Faye followed in her mother's footsteps. She got married at age 15 and moved away. So Betty then sent 10-year-old Phyllis and 8-year-old Robbie to live with their father and his new wife. Connie went to live with her sister Faye, and Shirley sometimes lived with Betty and sometimes with friends. But Bobby, who was only 3 when his parents got divorced, seemed to be the only child who held a solid place in Betty's heart. He was the only child she refused to hand over to other family members.
Yeah, I'm not sure why, but she did seem to have more of a bond with him, maybe just because he was so young. But it was a very fractured family with all these people living in different places.
Oh, yeah, they're all over the place.
They really are. Now, about a year after the divorce, Betty began seeing a house painter. He was 7 years her senior. His name was Billy Lane. They married months later in July of 1970. So now in her 30s, Betty had a more difficult time maintaining her hourglass figure, and she began abusing the diet drug Dexatrim. So in her way of thinking, if she took more of the drug than recommended, she'd lose more weight more quickly, right? If 1 is good, 2's better.
Right.
But these large doses really caused her to be irritable and restless. She didn't sleep much. She had frequent headaches. Betty's behavior began to change, and her children noticed that she was beginning to have like 2 distinct personalities. And she'd flip from one moment to the next, from the caring mother they loved to a woman who screamed at them and berated them.
Well, you know, she's taking an amphetamine.
Right.
Or at least a form of amphetamine. And so, yeah, I think of her as somebody hooked on speed.
I think so. I think we're looking back at 1970. It probably wasn't really a controlled drug. I don't think you could buy something like that over the counter now.
Oh, no.
And she was taking large amounts of it. You know, but it's funny to me, or not funny, humorous, but a little strange, that she was never really physically abusive with her children. Even though she had been physically abused, she would mostly just yell at them. She would call them names. She wasn't Mother of the Year by any means. But she didn't beat her children.
No. But Billy beat her.
Exactly.
So that was adding to Betty's issues. This physical abuse by Billy started just days after they got married.
You hear that all the time. If someone's in a relationship and it's not abusive, but it becomes abusive, it seems to start right after the wedding. I think that they feel like, oh, now I've got her.
Yeah.
So now it's harder for her to run away, which is true, especially back then.
Yeah, so in the months that followed, the abuse escalated until Billy was punching Betty and beating her several days a week, which, as you can expect, upset the kids. Billy liked to hit Betty in the face, because he knew how vain she was. She tried to cover up the bruises with makeup, but it didn't really work. Betty finally took out a restraining order against Billy that October, and they were divorced 2 months later. But even after the divorce, they continued to have a love-hate relationship.
Yeah, these two were just like oil and vinegar. Not a good match. Not mixing well.
Yeah, Betty would drive home some nights from work, and she would see Billy in a car with his lights out, sitting near her apartment.
Basically stalking her, yeah.
Yeah. And other nights she'd look in her rearview mirror and see him following her. And the violence did increase, until in May of 1971, Billy broke her nose. In the hospital, the doctor didn't suggest that she would report the abuse. Instead, he prescribed an antidepressant.
Yeah, so this is how women were treated. I might say that many doctors still treat women this way. You go in, you complain of something, and it's okay, honey, here you go, take this pill. And definitely it was that way with abuse back in the 70s. It wasn't something that was reported all the time, and they didn't even get her any kind of help to try and help her get out of the situation.
No,
it was basically just deal with it. Here's a pill that might make you feel less depressed.
Yeah, that's the way it was.
Yes. So Betty and Billy, they were just trouble. They continued to go to the same bars where they'd first met, and they'd glare at each other with jealousy when they danced or talked with someone else. And they always did that. They wanted to make each other jealous. Betty really seemed to enjoy making Billy jealous. She'd dance seductively with other men right in front of him. And he was just as bad using other women like she was using other men. And this was the game they played. Then in January of 1972, Billy walked up to Betty after she had danced with another man, and he told her, "You go home now, or I'm going to kill you." So on her drive home, she saw a police cruiser, and she honked at him to stop. After hearing her story, the officer assured her that he'd watch out for Billy's car and keep an eye on her apartment. So she arrived home safely, and after a few minutes, the police car went on and did his regular rounds. Then that night, the Dallas County Sheriff received an emergency call from Betty's apartment at 1:45 a.m. When the deputies got there, they found a man lying unconscious in a pool of his own blood right outside of her apartment's rear door. The man had been shot and had fallen down 3 concrete steps. So Betty told the police that Billy had been calling her apartment all evening, and her daughter Connie had answered the phone. Then, shortly after Betty got home, Billy had called again and told her that he was coming over to kill her. Betty said that she begged Billy over the phone, "Please don't come over." And when he hung up the phone, she was just hysterical, and she told her daughter Connie not to answer the door. But then she went and got her .22 pistol from her bedroom.
Yeah, Betty said she pulled out the gun and laid it on the bar by the door. Then, only about 10 minutes later, she heard knocking at her back door. And that's when she screamed for Connie to call the police. And at the same time, Billy was yelling and threatening to break down the door. So Betty opened the door, Billy rushed in. Betty was terrified as he backed her up against the bar. So she grabbed the gun. She told him to leave, but he didn't seem to take her seriously. And that's when she shot him, repeatedly, as he was falling backwards out the door and down the steps.
So the deputies listened to Betty's story, and then they read her rights. They drove her down to the station, where she waived her right to an attorney, and she gave a statement admitting that she had shot Billy Lane. The officers questioned her, though. They said, "Well, why did we find 2 bullet wounds in Billy's back if he'd been coming at you when you shot him?" And Betty had no answer to that. So she was charged with assault with intention to commit murder with malice. Pretty serious charge. She could go away for quite a while. And looking back, it's kind of a shame that she didn't. Now, before Betty had been taken to the station, there'd been a 3rd deputy on the scene. So he had stayed at Betty's apartment to take a statement from her daughter Connie. And Connie cried as she told this deputy what she had heard while listening on a bedroom extension when Billy called. Connie said when Billy called, he had told her mother, "I'm coming over to kill you, and juvenile services will come out and get the kids." So Betty told Connie to get out of the house, and she had yelled at Billy to leave. And that's when Connie heard gunshots and ran to the kitchen. She looked outside, she said, and she saw Billy lying on the ground. But Billy Lane's daughter, Barbara, also claimed to have listened in on a telephone extension at his house, and she told a deputy, "It was Betty who called Dad. She was crying and she asked Dad to come over and get his things. He asked, 'How many times are you going to shoot me?' And she told him none. Then he also asked, 'Well, how many police will be there?' And she said none." So according to Barbara, her dad wanted her to meet him at a different location, but Betty wouldn't do that. So she said, "My dad left at 1:10 a.m. and told me he'd be back in 30 minutes. And she said she'd begged him not to go, but he went anyway.
And after the police had arrived at Betty's apartment and called an ambulance, they ordered the driver to take Billy Lane to the hospital. He was in critical condition, and the doctors had to perform surgery to remove the 2 bullets.
Well, he was really pretty lucky that he hadn't died.
He was. Now, as you can imagine, Billy's version of the events that night differed from Betty's. Because of his injuries, he wasn't strong enough to give a statement until a week later. Then he told investigators, "I was at my daughter's home watching television when Betty called and asked me to come over just to talk. I thought it was too late, and I asked her if it couldn't wait till morning. She said if I didn't come right then, I could just forget it. So I climbed into my car and drove over there. But when I got to the back door of her apartment, everything was dark. I called to her to open the door, but she told me to leave. I guess she changed her mind about having a talk. The next thing I know, she's at the door holding a gun on me. So I start to leave and she fires the darn thing. I was still able to move, but she fired again, and I lost consciousness. Last thing I remember was her saying, 'If you move, I'll shoot again.'"
So if that's true, she's pretty cold-blooded.
I guess, huh?
It sounds like it was a premeditated thing. Billy would spend 3 weeks in the hospital recovering, followed by several weeks of physical therapy, and one of the bullets had damaged a nerve to his right leg, leaving him unable to walk for quite a while. After he was released from the hospital, Betty ended up going back to him, and the police really didn't know what to think about this strange case. But just days before the hearing, Billy walked up to them on his crutches, and he said, "I'm willing to sign an affidavit that I threatened Betty." So he didn't want her to be in trouble. He was defending her now.
He was.
And with no one to press charges, the court had to drop the murder charge down to a misdemeanor aggravated assault. So in court, Betty pleaded guilty to the lesser charge, and Billy paid her $100 fine and her $50 of court costs. She was able to also convince the judge to return her gun to her. Then Betty and Billy Lane remarried.
Huh.
Now, the crowd at the bar figured, Betty had probably promised to remarry Billy in exchange for his cooperation on getting her a plea reduction, because he did still have a thing for her. But that second marriage between them lasted only 1 month, and that was a volatile month, not a month you'd want to live through.
I can bet.
And after that, now 35-year-old Betty packed up and moved with her youngest child, Bobby, to Little Rock, Arkansas. Just 1 week after moving, Betty met a new man at a country and western bar. This was Ronnie Threlkeld. Now, he was an auto parts salesman, divorced with no children. And on the same night they met, Betty invited Ronnie to come home with her. So he did, and from then on, he was living with her. And for the next 4 years, the couple had a pretty good romance, and they seemed happy. Ronnie drove a truck, and Betty got a CB radio. She took the handle Tiger. And Ronnie said, well, that name sure fits. So whenever Ronnie came within her CB range, he'd call her and ask, how's the tiger in that tank? But unfortunately, any relationship with Betty was bound to be volatile. They had heated arguments, and Ronnie could be quite abusive. Betty took revenge on him by slashing his tires. Then after one argument, Betty went after him with a tire jack. Then she surprised him when she said she wanted to move back to Dallas. He still wanted to be with her, but he had a difficult decision to make. He had always lived in Little Rock, and his family and many of his friends lived there. But Ronnie went ahead and followed Betty to Texas. He figured he could sell auto parts anywhere. They moved to Dallas, and they were married in February of 1978. But shortly after the wedding, Ronnie started to feel kind of tied down. He decided he still had wild oats to sow. So he drank and he played pool with his buddies, while Betty stayed home taking care of Bobby. Once, when he came home drunk, he quietly let himself in the back door, but he was surprised by Betty waiting for him in the kitchen. And she was angry. She was disgusted with him, she said, and she told him there's got to be a good man out there who's looking for a good woman like me. So after that, keeping herself slim and attractive was Betty's obsession. She continued to abuse Dexatrim, and she had some severe mood swings. Bobby was 12 years old by then. He told one friend, "One moment we got along fine, and the next thing, my mom's a different person. It was like she got hateful all of a sudden, and there was no way to predict it." Bobby soon noticed that it didn't matter whether or not she'd been drinking either. She could just change in the middle of a sentence. Her face would tighten up and her voice would become deeper. It was almost like there were two different people living inside of Betty. The whole family had heard stories about Betty's mother's mental illness, and they really hoped that Betty had not inherited it, because she didn't seem well.
Oddly, after Betty and Ronnie were living in Dallas, she saw her own daughters as competition for his attention.
Well, now, let's look back at her life. What was she ever really valued for? Her looks.
She was good-looking, good figure.
And I think that's all that she really saw that she had to offer. So, when she has a man and she has her daughters who are obviously younger, and they might be more attractive than her because she's getting older, she would feel threatened. And that makes sense to me when you think about the life she led. Getting married at 15, the only way she could really get validated was by her looks or sex. So I can see why she would think that way, even though it seems really strange.
The girls, Faye, Connie, Phyllis, and Shirley, didn't live with them, but Betty was always complaining that they were getting into trouble and asking her for money. What's more, if they spent any time at all talking with Ronnie, Betty would accuse him of sleeping with her.
Yeah, like, it does sound out there, but like I said, it kind of makes sense, doesn't it?
Well, yeah.
Yeah. Now, there came a day when Ronnie was sitting at the kitchen table having a drink, and one of Betty's daughters came into the room wearing just a robe. Now, we don't know if she intended to tease Ronnie, or if she really liked him, or if she just wanted to spite her mother. But she made conversation with Ronnie, and she ended up removing her robe, letting it drop to the floor. And as luck would have it, Betty walked in on her daughter naked in the kitchen with her husband. Well, as you can imagine, Betty went ballistic. She screamed at Ronnie that she knew something was going on, and Ronnie argued with her, and he claimed to be totally innocent, but Betty was not having it. Her daughter had grabbed her robe and ran out as soon as she saw her mother, but Betty was livid. So the next day, Ronnie packed his belongings into his car. Betty came home when he was out by his car, and she tried to run him over, but he was able to get out of the way in time. And then Ronnie decided he just went home to Little Rock and put the whole thing behind him.
I'm out of here.
Which is probably wise.
Soon after her divorce from Ronnie, in August of 1979, Betty started going to a strip club in a rough area of Dallas, the Charlie's Angels Bar. She watched a woman on stage stripping and thought she could do that too. Betty approached the manager, and he told her she'd have to audition. She was 42 at this time, but she told the manager she was 32. So she showed up on an audition night, but found that stripping was more complicated than she'd imagined. She accidentally pulled a pasty off one of her nipples, and in an effort to cover up the mistake, invited men from the audience to help her reapply it.
Oh, gosh.
One man actually came up on stage and groped her breast, and then an officer from the Dallas Vice Squad arrested her and charged her with public lewdness. The judge fined her $250, put her in jail for 30 days.
Yeah.
Jeez. And then on probation for a year.
Yeah, so that seems pretty harsh. But that was the end of her career as a stripper.
Short-lived.
Yeah. Well, 42, that's getting up there to be stripping.
Yeah, even if she does look 32.
Even if she looked great, you can't just stand there. You have to have some moves. Now, after Betty got out of jail, she began looking for a fourth husband. So she was filling her truck with gas in Mesquite one day when a tall, handsome man struck up a conversation with her. So this was Doyle Wayne Barker, who went by Wayne, and he worked in construction as a roofer. He was a lot like Betty's other husbands. He looked like them, physically fit, dark hair, brown eyes, and olive skin. Wayne had been married once before for 8 years, and he had 2 sons. So when Betty invited him to her Dallas apartment, he got along really well with her son Bobby. He seemed like a nice guy. And after seeing him for a couple of weeks, Betty told everyone, "You know, Wayne is just the man I've been looking for all these years." But she'd actually said that about each of her other husbands early on as well.
Oh, sure.
So Betty and Wayne were married in Dallas on October 3rd, 1979. But Betty and Wayne were almost immediately fighting. They separated just 7 weeks after their wedding ceremony, and they eventually divorced in January of 1980.
So let's see, that's a 3-month marriage.
Yeah, pretty short. But shortly after that, Betty suffered head injuries from a serious car accident. She actually had a skull fracture and a cerebral concussion. The migraine headaches she'd had as a child returned, and her hearing loss became worse. So she was somewhat needy when Wayne came back, and he told her he was sorry for all of their disagreements. If she'd just give him another chance, he said, he'd be a new man. So Betty remarried him in 1981. And her family told her they just couldn't understand why she'd remarry someone who had caused her so many problems. But Betty just assured them that this time it would be different.
Well, this is the second time she's remarried a former spouse.
Right.
And she's getting plenty of practice.
She is.
Betty and Wayne had frequently been guests of Wayne's boss at his Cedar Creek home. Betty loved it there and decided that she wanted them to move to that area. She promised to buy a wooded half-acre lot for $8,800 if Wayne would match the cost and buy a new trailer. Betty had her eye on a modern 2-bedroom trailer. Wayne agreed, so they moved to Cedar Creek Lake. Betty had never lived in a brand-new home before, so she loved decorating and furnishing the trailer.
Yeah, this was one point in her life when she did seem really happy. After that move, Betty enrolled Bobby in the public junior high where he seemed to fit in well, and he made friends. Wayne and Betty got along really well at first, too. Betty would drive Wayne to his boss Jerry Kay's home each morning at 5 o'clock to ride to work with him. And each evening, Jerry dropped Wayne back at his house. Jerry stood on his porch one morning as Betty drove up, and he said, "You know, this old Wayne of yours is probably as nice a person as you'd ever want to meet." And Betty smiled at her husband and nodded in agreement. So it seemed like Wayne was a pretty nice guy.
Yeah, we're doing okay.
There wasn't the abuse as there had been in the other marriages. But one thing was that Wayne insisted on spending time with his 2 sons from his previous marriage, which sounds reasonable. They were 14 and 16.
Yeah, this is entirely reasonable, right?
Yeah, it does, but Betty really resented the time he spent away from her. The boys had really only been over to the trailer a few times, but Wayne would avoid tension between Betty and his sons by arranging to meet them at the local McDonald's or at a park. He really liked to have them over for an entire weekend, but then taking the backlash from Betty afterwards just made it seem like it wasn't really worth the trouble. He just really wanted to keep her happy and see his sons, so he was kind of, riding the line there back and forth.
Yes. Betty confided to her children that Wayne was slapping her like he had before their first separation, so they suggested that she divorce him. But she told them, "Not yet. Let me handle this in my own way." Her children liked Wayne. He was always nice to them, but just as they saw Betty could become 2 different people, they wondered if Wayne had a dark side that they hadn't yet seen.
And that's certainly possible, but I think it's also possible that Wayne was just a nice guy, and Betty was trying to get some sympathy there.
One night in October 1981, Betty and her daughter Shirley, who was 22 at that time, built a bonfire by the lake on Betty's property. Except for Shirley's curvy figure, she looked nothing like her mother. She had her father's coloring and wore her straight black hair in braids. She had driven down from her house that evening to talk with her mother about Wayne, hoping that Betty would file for a divorce.
Well, yeah, Betty's telling her kids, "Wayne's abusing me." And they're telling her, "We'll get a divorce." And she's saying, well, no, she's got some other things in mind, apparently.
Oh, yeah, because as they were sitting and chatting, Shirley asked her mom what she was planning to do about Wayne. I'm going to kill him, Betty said pretty matter-of-factly. Shirley laughed, and she assumed that Betty was joking.
As you would.
No kidding. Betty was silent for a moment. Then she said that she couldn't get a divorce or she would lose her trailer, which was in Wayne's name.
Yep.
Now, Shirley told her mother that she could buy herself a new trailer with her earnings from her job at the Cedar Club. Then she could get a restraining order against Wayne. But Betty had her mind made up. She told Shirley that she wouldn't get caught. She had planned every detail. Betty pointed to an open space in the trees behind them. See that hole? Betty pointed to a mound of loose dirt that had been freshly turned. That's where it's going to be. No one will ever find him. Betty explained that she had asked one of the construction men working on the road to dig her a hole for a barbecue pit, and he had.
Yeah, men were willing to do a lot of things for Betty because she was very flirtatious and knew how to work what she had. But Shirley was hopeful that her mom was just kidding or would change her mind about this. But then the next day, Betty drove Bobby to Shirley's house to spend the night with her. After Betty confirmed that Bobby would be sleeping overnight there, she left to go back home. So all that day, Shirley could think of nothing else than her mother's plan to kill her husband. That evening, Betty stood outside in the hallway outside of her bedroom, listening to Wayne snoring. She entered the room in the dark and went to her nightstand where she kept her loaded .38 caliber revolver. She removed her gun from the top drawer, then pulled back the sheet and climbed into the bed. The several shots of whiskey she'd taken before getting into bed, she felt would help her go through with this plan.
Yeah, there weren't any houses near Betty, but there was a family that lived a couple lots away. Betty didn't know if they were light sleepers or not, so she tried to think of a way to suppress the sound of a gunshot. She picked up the pillow, held it over the gun as she aimed it at Wayne's head. Her hand shook a little bit from nervousness as she took a deep breath and pulled the trigger. Now, despite the pillow, the sound of the gunshot was pretty loud in the bedroom.
I bet it was.
The surrounding metal of the trailer echoed as well. Though Wayne's body jerked, she worried that the pillow had thrown off her aim. So quickly she cocked the gun again and fired again at his head. She fired a third time. Warm, sticky blood gushed over Betty's hand. She touched his neck to check his pulse, and he was definitely dead.
Wow. Well, Shirley couldn't sleep at all that night. She got out of bed and called her oldest sister, Faye, to see if she knew what their mother was up to. So, it's late. The phone rang several times before Faye answered. She'd clearly been asleep, and she asked Shirley what's going on. Shirley asked Faye if she had spoken to their mother, trying to see if maybe Betty had said something to her. But Faye said she hadn't heard from Betty in weeks. So Shirley decided not to tell her sister what Betty was planning. She hoped that Betty had just been drunk and wouldn't really go through with the plan. So Shirley told Faye that she just had a bad dream, and they got off the phone. Shirley wasn't really surprised that her mother hadn't confided in Faye, who was known as the rule follower in the family. Shirley called up her other sisters, but all three sisters gave the same answers. None of them had talked to Betty in weeks. But the fact that her brother Bobby was now sleeping in the next bedroom made Shirley realize that Betty had got him out of her house so he wouldn't be there when she went through with killing Wayne. She just wished that her mother had never even confided in her. She didn't want to know. But back at Betty's, her nightgown was soaked with perspiration and Wayne's blood, and she seemed to have no guilt over Wayne's murder. In fact, she was really relieved that he was dead. Now no one could take her trailer away, and she was free to find her next husband. But when she turned on the light, she was probably pretty surprised by the amount of blood. The entire bedroom was spattered with blood. The sheets were dark red, blood had splashed on the walls, and it was puddling onto the floor. Wayne's hair was clotted with blood, of course, but blood was also pouring through his gunshot wounds.
Yeah, it's going to be an awful big task to make that trailer livable.
I know, and thinking that this was premeditated.
Yeah.
Why would you do it that way to make such a mess?
I know.
Seems like she could have come up with something better. But another thing is that, Betty was not super intelligent. She had some brain damage, actually. So maybe she wasn't the best at making a plan.
Yeah, Betty walked into the bathroom and washed Wayne's blood from her hands. Gunpowder was smudged on her hand. She took off her nightgown, put it in the sink filled with cold water to soak, then put on an old T-shirt. Back in her bedroom, she opened the closet and got 2 sheets of green plastic that a new chair had come wrapped in. She tried to tuck the plastic around Wayne's body, and then she took a blue canvas sleeping bag and unzipped it. She rolled Wayne's body onto it. Now, of course, he's much heavier than she had expected, and it took her a lot of effort and time to get his body in the bag. Once she did, she zipped up the bag and rolled him onto the edge of the bed, then pushed him onto the floor. She removed her clothes and shoes from her closet and put Wayne inside it. She had to push hard to move him back far enough so she could shut the sliding door. And it's so comical.
Yeah, it's quite an image that it puts in your mind, yes. So Betty took another look at the room and assessed the mess. Then she sprayed Lysol on the headboard, walls, and floor. Not wanting the blood to dry completely, she scrubbed all the surfaces thoroughly, and she spent much of that night washing the bedding and her clothing. She rinsed blood out of towels over and over again until the water was pink. Then she put them into the washing machine, and once everything was finally cleaned, she took herself a long hot shower. Mentally and physically exhausted, Betty went to bed, and she slept like a baby. But after making all those late-night phone calls to her sisters the night before, Shirley slept until noon. Her live-in boyfriend, Larry, had left her a note saying that he'd gone to work and took Bobby to a friend's house to spend the night. When Shirley walked into her living room, she was shocked to see her mother, Betty, sitting there on her sofa. And Betty said, "It's over. I did what I told you I was going to do." Well, this just hit Shirley like a brick wall. She couldn't believe how casual her mother sounded. She stood in front of her mother, just really unable to move or speak for a moment. Then Betty proceeded to tell her every detail of the murder, starting with her issues with the pillow to putting Wayne's body into her closet.
Shirley had grown up in a family where you just didn't question the mother. She loved her mother, but she didn't want to ask any questions that would make Betty angry with her. Especially recently, it didn't take much to set Betty off. So Shirley tried to rationalize Betty's actions by remembering her mother's stories about Wayne abusing her. She wondered if a judge might consider killing a wife abuser an act of self-defense.
Well, probably not when you shoot them in their sleep.
Probably not. But what if Betty got arrested and went to prison? She couldn't imagine that. If she didn't help her mother, Betty might get caught. And almost whispering, Shirley asked her mother, "Have you figured out what you're going to do?"
Yeah, Betty said, "Well, sure, I'm going to put Wayne's body into the barbecue pit." She told Shirley don't worry about it. But Shirley wondered how Betty would get Wayne's large body out of the house and into the pit on her own. Feeling like she was already an accessory to this crime, Shirley volunteered to help her mother. Betty made her promise not to tell anyone, and Shirley agreed. So Betty said, "Tell Larry that Wayne and I got into a big fight and I'm scared shitless of him. Say I don't want to be home alone tonight in case he comes back and wants to hurt me again. Then you come over after dinner and we'll wait till dark before we stick him in the ground." So Shirley leaned against the wall and nodded. She felt very sad. She just wanted this whole thing to go away. How could her own mother be involved in a murder and get her involved in a murder? So for the rest of that day, Betty stayed at Shirley's house and talked. She couldn't stop rambling on and on about killing Wayne. And while Shirley just wanted to forget it, her mother seemed to need to go over every gory detail, like a catharsis. "Tomorrow we'll go and get some cinder blocks," Betty told her. "We can build a patio over him, and no one will ever know that he's there."
So when the two women got to Betty's trailer that night, Shirley followed her mother down the hall to the bedroom. Betty switched on the bedroom light and opened the closet door. Shirley saw a big blue mound inside, looking like Wayne was sitting up. Shirley went into the clean little kitchen, got some milk, vodka, Kahlua, a pitcher, and 2 plastic glasses. She took them out to the yard where she and Betty used flashlights to see. "We're going to have White Russians."
Right.
Betty gathered branches and leaves and scattered them over some dry wood. She lit a fire where they could sit and drink and distract themselves from the dead body in the closet.
I think it would take more than a couple of White Russians.
No kidding. Shirley tried to concentrate on the fire, but her mother wanted to talk about Wayne's murder some more. Shirley had already heard too much, but she let her mother continue while she stared blankly into the flames. Shirley mixed up a pitcher of White Russians. They sipped and talked until Betty looked at her watch and said, "Almost midnight. It's time."
Ugh, how horrible. So the two women went back inside the trailer and down the hall. Once inside the bedroom, Betty opened the closet, and they began dragging Wayne out. Shirley grabbed his feet while Betty moved the upper torso, and Shirley could see an outline of a head through the canvas. Both women slowly slid the body across the carpet. Then they dragged it down the hall and out the trailer's back door. When they went outside with him, the moonlight was very bright. Shirley looked at the road, worrying that someone might come driving down their street and see them. Dragging him, Wayne's body thumped down the 3 back steps. And once they had the body lying by the side of the gravesite, the two women cleared out the loose soil with shovels that Betty had kept under her trailer. And they rolled Wayne into the 4-foot-deep hole and tried to flatten him down into it. Then, picking up their shovels, they covered him with dirt. As Wayne's body was more and more concealed, the mound of dirt became quite high, forcing them to shovel the rest of the soil into flower pots. "Don't worry, cinder blocks will hide all that," Betty told her daughter. Then, after they were done, they went back into the house, and Shirley got very drunk. But there just wasn't enough alcohol to make her forget what she'd seen, and especially what she'd done. So Shirley was awake most of the night in the spare bedroom at her mother's trailer. Every time she thought of her mother sleeping in that next room, the room where she'd killed Wayne just the night before, she felt physically ill. The next morning, Shirley got out of bed, and she jumped as music began to play loudly from her mother's room. In a few minutes, Betty stood at Shirley's bedroom doorway, and Betty looked great. She wore a pair of freshly pressed jeans, a soft turquoise sweater, and perfect makeup. "Time to rise and shine," Betty said cheerfully. "I'll go put the coffee on and make some toast. We really got to go pick up those cinder blocks we talked about." Then Betty called Wayne's boss Jerry at 5 a.m. It was the time when he would expect her to drop her husband off for his ride to work, as she'd been doing 5 mornings a week. When Jerry answered the phone, Betty said to him, "Well, Wayne's run off." And Jerry was shocked. Betty told him that she and Wayne had fought the night before and he had stormed out. She said that he said he was going to get some cigarettes, but he never came back. Well, Jerry just couldn't believe it. He said, "Guys like Wayne don't just leave. And I've got him in charge of a big crew that we have going this morning. I talked to him just last night and he sounded fine." After finishing his 3rd day of work without his best employee, Jerry drove to Wayne's home to see if he could learn any more about him disappearing so abruptly.
Yeah, Jerry pulled up to the trailer and he was relieved because he saw Wayne's truck parked in the driveway. He rang the doorbell. When Betty answered, he told her that he was glad that Wayne had changed his mind and returned. But Betty was abrupt and sullen. "He did leave," Betty said. Jerry asked about his truck. How would Wayne leave without his truck? Betty just stared at him, clearly annoyed, and she didn't invite him in, and she didn't seem interested in talking.
Well, Jerry was very fond of Wayne.
Yeah.
He really did seem like a good guy. The only one who said that he was abusive or did anything wrong was Betty. And how reliable of a source do you think she is? It's really hard to say.
Right.
But Betty said she hadn't heard from Wayne at all, and Jerry told her if she heard from him, tell him that I'll keep his job waiting. So Betty just nodded and shut the door pretty much in his face, and Jerry stood staring at the closed door for a minute, just thinking, well, something's not right here. What happened to the friendly Betty who spent so much time with him and his wife? And why would Wayne just disappear? So as he went back to his car, Jerry looked at Wayne's truck again. He just shook his head. A man does not leave his new pickup and go away. So Jerry was still questioning Wayne's disappearance when Betty showed up cool as a cucumber the following Friday at his office to pick up Wayne's paycheck. Now that she was interested in.
Well, yeah. After speaking with Bobby, Betty's daughter Faye called Betty at home. She asked about Wayne being gone. Betty answered that it was a good thing Wayne had run away, because he treated her badly. According to Betty, she and Wayne had had a really bad argument, and he just stomped out the front door, saying he was going to get some cigarettes.
That's a bit of a cliche, even.
Right.
An old cliche, yeah.
He never returned, Betty said. They asked why his truck was left behind, and Betty said she's going to sell it.
Well, Betty is really interested in the money.
I caught that.
Okay.
Now, with Wayne gone, Betty had no worries about finding a new man. Her job at the Cedar Club allowed her to meet and flirt with new men all the time.
Located in a concrete block building that had been painted over many, many times, the club's current color was a dull, dark gray. The windows were painted gray, too, to keep out the sun, and there was a horseshoe-shaped bar in the middle of a large room with glasses hanging upside down from an overhead rack. 4 pool tables sat off to the left of the bar, and there were dartboards bolted on the walls to the right of the bar. So once inside, there was no way to tell that you were drinking in the middle of the day or even early in the morning. Happy hour was from 7 to 11 a.m. For many of the regulars, drinking from morning to night was just a way of life. Now, Betty's choices for quality men at the club were limited, but she did find them adequate. There were a lot of cowboys, old drunks, but there was also the odd attractive man with a good job. And money's important to her, so he has to have a good job.
Absolutely.
So Betty kept a lookout for the attractive ones who made decent money. Her tough wit and flirtatious personality really fit in with this crowd, and most of the customers just adored her. She was fun to be around. So as Betty worked the room, she smiled at every man who looked her way. And when she caught the eye of a handsome new customer, she began to walk more seductively and pout her lips. She stepped over to his table and said, "What would you like, sir?" "You," he said. "Why don't you come sit down here?" And he patted the seat of his chair next to him. "Much as I'd like to, I'm afraid fraternizing is against the rules. Besides, you look like you wouldn't have any trouble finding company," Betty said, probably giving him one of her famous little winks and hip shakes.
Oh, sure. Gotta work 'em.
So this handsome stranger introduced himself to Betty as Jimmy Don. He told her that he'd worked for the Dallas Fire Department and he'd be retiring in 4 years. He told her about his boat and how he loved to fish. Betty said she'd love to spend her days fishing, but barmaids didn't get those kind of benefits. So she was already considering what a relationship with this man could do for her. So tell me a little bit about Jimmy Don, because he seemed like a nice guy.
Jimmy Don Beets had grown up in Texas. He and his first wife had one son, James, who everyone called Jamie. 3 years after Jamie was born, the couple had a second son, but this baby died at just 5 hours of age. 2 years after that, they had a stillborn daughter.
Wow, that's horrible.
There was. Certainly dealing with these 2 deaths was difficult. And Jimmy Don self-medicated with alcohol. His wife tried to work things out, but his new drinking lifestyle was too much for her. The couple divorced when Jamie was 9. Jamie, who loved his parents very much, somehow felt responsible for the divorce, and he became quite depressed. He lived with his mother until he was 12. By then, Jimmy Don was remarried. He had met his second wife, Susie, through mutual friends in Dallas. Susie had been married once before, but had no children. She really liked to spend time with Jimmy Don and his son. Susie showered Jamie with attention, and then after 6 months together, Susie and Jimmy Don got married.
Well, that sounds a lot more reasonable. 6 months. It's still fairly quick, though.
Yeah. They built a home near Cedar Lake Creek. Jimmy Don drove to the fire department each day, and Susie drove into Dallas for her job. When they moved into a bigger home, Jamie moved in with them. They were very popular in the boating community where they lived, and they had many, many friends. Jimmy Don enjoyed his days off, fishing, swimming, barbecuing. For Jamie, living with his dad and Susie was fun and exciting. So these were some pretty good years for the family. Jamie grew into a handsome young man who did well in school. He graduated high school just 3 years. That's some work.
Yeah, he was a bright boy. As a reward for this, Jimmy Don bought Jamie a car and let him have the summer free without working. But that unfortunately led to some issues. It was kind of the downfall of Jamie. With so much free time on his hands, Jamie began running with a pretty rough crowd. And then he started using drugs. That same summer created a break between the father and son. Jimmy Don was really angry about the drugs, and Jamie really showed no more initiative for going to college or even getting a job. Because of the constant arguments over how to handle Jamie, Susie ended up divorcing Jimmy Don after 14 years of marriage. Jimmy Don didn't know how to live on his own, so he quickly remarried, and then he ended up divorcing again 3 months later. But Susie and Jimmy Don were still in contact. They still cared quite a bit for each other. They were actually talking about reconciling. But then all that ended after Jimmy Don got involved with Betty Lou.
The weekend after she first met Jimmy Don, Betty was giddy to see him come back to the club. She stood at the bar as he approached her. He said, "I'm not one to drag things out. I've got the weekend off so we can spend some time Saturday, unless you're already busy. Weather's supposed to be good. How about going boating? I keep my boat near my house." So Betty was very pleased to hear Jimmy Don talk about his house and his boat. Her adding machine is going jing, jing, jing.
Well, I think with each husband, she's kind of stepping up the amount of money they make. But Jimmy Don was really above and beyond the rest of them. He was doing fairly well.
Yeah, so Jimmy Don stayed at the bar for about an hour or so, and he made arrangements to pick up Betty at 10 the next morning.
So he must have been anxious to see her because it wasn't even 10 when Jimmy Don stood at the front door of Betty's trailer. Now she came to the door with a smile, and she'd actually packed a wicker picnic basket. So it all seems very wholesome. He walked her outside and opened the door of his car for her, and it took about 10 minutes to drive out to his house. Jimmy Don's house wasn't right on the lake, but his friends' houses across the street were, and everyone had a long dock and a boathouse. He had several neighbors who were willing to let him tie his boat at their docks. So he carried the picnic basket and walked Betty across the street to show her his boat. So if Jimmy Don hadn't been in love with Betty before that, he did fall in love with her that day out on his boat. He really enjoyed the way Betty gave him affection and praise. I would say she knew what she was doing.
Yeah, it's all calculated.
Yes. She would sit on his lap and whisper in his ear, and he really couldn't resist her. At first, the neighbors appeared uncomfortable with their public displays of affection, too, and they'd tease him about it. But then Betty seemed bored when the neighbors chatted about their own lives. And after about a month of seeing each other, Jimmy Don partially moved into Betty's trailer. He really thought he'd found the woman who would spend his retirement years with him, and Betty was on board with that, at least at the time. After hearing Betty call him the man she'd been looking for all her life. Remember, she said that about all the husbands.
Yeah, keeping a trend going here.
But it made Jimmy Don feel special, I guess, and he decided to propose. So another quick proposal. Betty enthusiastically accepted. This is what she'd been pushing for all along. Even though Jimmy Don rarely saw his son Jamie anymore, he called to tell him that he was about to remarry. Jamie, by this time, was in his mid-20s, and he was married with 2 young children.
So he got out of the drugs and was doing okay.
Seems like he did, yeah. But still, there were issues between father and son.
Oh, sure.
But Jimmy Don loved his grandchildren, and that's why he helped Jamie out financially. When he took Betty to meet them, Jamie was looking at her very suspiciously. And you can't blame him. I mean, his dad hasn't been really careful. He had just gotten married a while back, and it didn't last.
Yeah, 3 months.
Yeah. So the more Betty and Jimmy Don talked about their life together, the more distant Jamie became. Jamie saved his opinion for the next visit when his father came alone, and at that time Jamie told his father, "I just can't stand her, Dad. She's a manipulative, self-centered bitch." And of course that didn't go over well. That's not the right way to deal with it because he's in love with this woman, so that's just going to make him more determined. And Jamie's words really shocked Jimmy Don. He'd made up his mind about Betty, and he thought everyone would love her. So it was August of 1982 when Betty and Jimmy Don went down to the courthouse and got married. Jimmy Don then moved completely into Betty's trailer. He really liked that the back of her property had an inlet that did connect to the lake, so now he no longer had to count on someone else for his boat.
Yeah, but within days of the wedding, Betty began criticizing Jimmy Don's generosity towards his son. Once she learned that a couple $1,000s a year was given to Jamie and his family, she was determined to put a stop to it. So she convinced Jimmy Don to have Jamie visit them in the trailer. Betty knew that he didn't like her, but she didn't like him either. After all, he was competition for Jimmy Don's money.
You're right. I mean, that's a good point, Dickie. I think that was the main problem.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
Jimmy Don told Jamie that he needed to start supporting his family on his own. He allowed Jamie and his family to live in his house near the lake, but he no longer gave them money. But he gave them a house.
He let them stay in the house, yeah. I don't think he signed it over to them, no, but he let them live there because he was living in Betty's trailer.
Right.
Which is still very generous.
I think so.
But it's really no skin off Betty's back, you know?
Right.
As the money would have been.
Yeah. Then in 1982, Betty and Jimmy Don celebrated their first Christmas together. Jamie avoided all that by taking his family to Salina, Texas, where his wife's mother lived. On December 28th, Jamie was still in Salina, and Jimmy Don was in Dallas, working at the fire station, when neighbors saw flames coming from Jimmy Don's house near the lake. Neighbors ran to grab a hose, but the water had been shut off.
So that was interesting, that someone had shut the water off.
Yeah.
So, likely arson.
Probably, huh?
Yes, because Jimmy Don's insurance company paid him several $1,000s for this fire damage to the house. He also had some really good handyman skills, so that saved him money too. When Betty learned about this windfall of cash, she had no intention of letting it go to Jamie Beets, even if Jamie's belongings did burn inside that house. So Jimmy Don ended up giving his son a check for less than $1,000 to compensate for lost clothing and other belongings. And not knowing how much his father got, Jamie was happy with that. It was enough to, purchase clothing and small things that had been lost. So there was some suspicion that Betty had started this fire. Obviously, that's what we're insinuating, but it was never proven. But there'll be another incident that'll make you think, yeah, she probably did do that.
Okay.
Right? Yeah.
In August of 1983, Betty's son Robbie went out front of his mother's trailer to see what Jimmy Don was working on. Jimmy Don was in the front yard with lumber and bricks. Robbie went to Jimmy Don's new Silverado truck, lowered its tailgate, carried more bricks over to Jimmy Don.
Yeah, Robbie really liked Jimmy Don.
Yeah.
He was good to him.
Jimmy Don explained to Robbie that Betty had asked him to build a wishing well. He showed Robbie a cleared patch of ground and told him to measure an area 4 feet square. Then he told him to hammer in some wooden pegs at each corner. Then both men dug until they were about a foot down in the soil. Jimmy Don looked at the project and said, "This isn't going to work. Any water we put there, like a real well is supposed to have, will drain out to the lake unless we line it with concrete." So Jimmy Don decided to turn the project into a planter. He filled it with dirt, and Betty planted flowers in it.
So August 6th, which is like the next day, Robbie was in his mother's kitchen when she told him she was going to kill Jimmy Don. Robbie pretty much fell into a chair and put his hands in his lap and asked her why. Betty said that Jimmy Don had a lot of insurance, and she was tired of worrying about money. And who knows when Jimmy Don will start slapping her around like every other man had before. So now she's not even claiming that he is abusive. She's just claiming, well, if I don't kill him, eventually he'll be abusive.
He's going to be an abuser.
Right. So Robbie remembered hearing about fights that his mother had with her other husbands, but Jimmy Don had never hit her once and was always so nice to her. They'd never even come close to having a serious argument as far as he knew. But Betty was very calm and sounded very matter-of-fact. Robbie didn't know what to do. He had only moved back home the last year, and he didn't want his mom to send him away again. But even when Robbie had messed up Jimmy Don's boat and motorcycle, Jimmy Don had treated him decently. He'd made him pay for the repairs, but he hadn't beaten him or yelled at him or anything, and he'd forgiven him. So for a moment, Robbie wondered if he should just warn Jimmy Don. But he didn't want his mother to turn on him, so he didn't.
This conversation happened at about 9 o'clock at night, and Jimmy Don was already in bed. His bedroom wasn't very far down the hall from where Betty and Robbie were discussing murdering him. Robbie asked if she wasn't worried about getting caught, but Betty said she had it all figured out. She just needed Robbie's help. She didn't ask Robbie to cooperate, but she certainly expected it.
Yeah, to him it just felt like he was expected to do it.
Well, that's what a good son will do.
Right. But he did wonder what his mother wanted him to do. She hadn't said anything specific, but he knew whatever it was, he didn't want to do it. So Betty quietly slipped into her bedroom. Not wanting to turn on the light, she kept on the light in the hall. She stood over the bed watching Jimmy Don sleep. With his insurance and his pension, Betty knew she would never have to worry about money again. So she was committed to following through, and she felt like she needed to kill him before the next morning. So quietly she put one knee on the bed and held her breath. Then she raised her pistol and aimed it at him. Betty shot Jimmy Don in his chest, hoping to hit his heart. Then she fired again at his head. There was blood everywhere. Turning on the bedroom light, she saw a sight worse than when she'd killed Wayne. Blood poured from Jimmy Don's head, nose, mouth, and chest. Again, blood covered the bed and the walls. Betty grasped her blue and white bedspread, rolled Jimmy Don's body into it, and tucked the spread tightly around his body. Jimmy Don's body weighed just as much as Wayne's had, and it was just as difficult to move. She kept the bedspread around him while she rolled him onto a sleeping bag. Then she zipped it and rolled him to the edge of the bed, pushing him off to the floor. She knew she needed to hurry up and clean the room before the blood dried into everything. She thought about Shirley helping her dispose of Wayne's body just 2 years earlier. So grabbing the phone, she called her daughter's number. She had told Shirley earlier that she planned to kill Jimmy Don, but Shirley had become furious with her. Shirley had yelled at her, "But Mom, you promised never to kill anyone again."
Jesus.
Mom, you promised.
You said you wouldn't do that anymore.
Right. But regardless, Betty now wanted to talk with Shirley, and as soon as Shirley answered, Betty said, "Well, I did it." And Shirley was upset, of course, but Betty insisted that she come over to her trailer.
Now, Robbie returned home with a pit in his stomach. He slowly opened the trailer's front door and looked inside. He heard the washer and dryer running and assumed that blood must have spilled onto things from the shooting. He saw his mother folding towels as she stood in front of the dryer. "Come with me," Betty told Robbie. She led him down the hall toward her bedroom. As they reached the back door, he saw a large blue mound propped up against the wall. That made him extremely anxious.
Well, sure.
Yeah, because now his mother had actually killed someone.
That would be so shocking.
Yeah, because remember, he doesn't know anything about Wayne.
Right. So this is all new to him.
Yeah, and he's thinking Mom could be in serious trouble.
Sure.
He remembered her as kind and loving, but now she was like a stranger to him. "Don't just stand there gawking, Robbie. We've got to get this out to the wishing well," Betty barked at him. She explained how she had asked Jimmy Don to build the wishing well for her after she decided to kill him.
Right, so this guy thought he was doing something nice for his wife to decorate their yard, but she's having him dig his own grave, literally.
Right.
So now it was almost midnight and the neighborhood was pretty quiet and calm. Robbie struggled as he helped Betty lift Jimmy Don's 195-pound body and dump it into the well, which Betty had gutted in preparation. So at the time of Jimmy Don's murder, 2 fishermen found his boat floating about 50 feet out from the dock. The motor was pulled out of the water like he'd had engine trouble, and his fishing license was lying on the bottom of the boat, along with a spilled bottle of nitroglycerin pills and a pair of his eyeglasses. The 2 fishermen who found the boat knew who Jimmy Don was. He was a Dallas Fire Department captain and a real nice guy, well liked, but there was no sign of Jimmy Don himself on or near the boat.
So his boat was towed back to the marina, where a group of people were gathering to find out what had happened. Stories were shared of fishing trips, barbecues, and just sitting around the Beets' living room, drinking beer while watching the Dallas Cowboys on TV. The marina's owner, Lil Smith, went inside for the phone book and found a listing for J.D. Beets. She called the number, but no one answered. After several unsuccessful tries, it was almost 10 o'clock in the morning when Betty answered. Lil told her about finding the boat, and Betty gasped. She said he had gone out fishing last night, and she'd been worried sick about him. She had already called the sheriff and reported him missing. Lil explained to Betty that she had tried to reach her earlier, but no one had answered the phone. Betty said she'd gone shopping with her sons in Dallas, and since they got home, she had been gardening. She must not have heard the phone ring.
Yeah, for our younger listeners, she had a landline. It's this phone we used to have that was attached to the wall. And you didn't get to carry a phone with you anywhere. It was rough living back in the day. But then, switching topics abruptly, Betty asked Lil if she could come down and pick up Jimmy Don's boat. Well, Lil told Betty she should really stay home by the phone in case Jimmy Don called her. But Betty said, "No, I'm a nervous wreck. I'm coming right over." So it was just 10 minutes later when a rushed Betty walked into the marina's office and said, "I came as soon as I could."
Yeah, Lil couldn't help but notice that the men were all staring at Betty's large breasts and puffed-up blonde hair, perfectly made up. Betty did not look like someone who had been gardening.
No.
So besides her perfect makeup, she wore a crisp white blouse with iron jeans.
Well, she'd been getting ready for this. This was like her premiere as an actress, right?
This is a performance coming up.
Yeah,
right?
She's preparing herself for it.
So Betty asked to see Jimmy Don's boat, and they took her outside to the dock. Gasping dramatically, she touched Jimmy Don's eyeglasses, pill bottle, and fishing license. "What on earth could have happened to him?" she said, shaking her head. "He was so good at fixing things. Of course, he did have a heart attack 5 years ago."
So she's sorry, but she's laying down the groundwork there.
Yes.
Of course, he did have a heart attack. I think that's pretty funny.
Lil's husband had drowned just a few years earlier, and she still remembered the overwhelming loss she'd felt. She'd screamed and cried for a long, long time. She, however, couldn't help admiring Betty's strength. She wasn't even crying.
No, she was tough as nails. There was a storm brewing over the water that day, so the sheriff decided the search would have to begin the next morning. And as soon as daylight came, a bunch of cars, pickup trucks, and vans made their way to the scene, many of them from Dallas. Over 50 firefighters had heard about Captain Beets's empty boat and were coming to help search for him. Having spent 24 hours a day eating and sleeping together, the firefighters knew each other like family. And when one of the firemen died, it was like one of their brothers had died. So over 100 boats were there for a bass fishing contest, and this turned into a search party for Jimmy Don. Wealthy residents in private planes scanned the lake for any sign of him, and Coast Guard helicopters hovered over the lake's surface looking for him. Never had there been so many people on that lake at one time. Using maps of the lake, investigators put together a detailed grid for an organized search. Cedar Creek ran through terrain with large rows of cedar trees. Boats were dispatched hourly to search parts of the lake, but there was no sign anywhere of Captain Beets. The Red Cross parked a mobile food center by the search headquarters, and they gave out cold drinks, sandwiches, and fruit to the heat-exhausted volunteers throughout the day. And this was a day with temperatures over 100 degrees, and humid.
Jimmy Don's father sat in his red pickup, watching the Coast Guard drag the lake. With tears in his eyes, he watched the giant rake scoop down into the water, drag across the bottom, then dump all sorts of trash onto a barge. As the old man watched the Coast Guard work, he saw a red and white Silverado pull up. He was excited for an instant, believing that his son had returned. But then he saw Betty open the driver's side door and climb out. "That damn woman," he said aloud to himself. "Jimmy Don ain't in this lake. No, sir. That bitch of a woman has done something really bad to my son."
Yeah, so he called it out that quickly. I guess they weren't really fond of Betty and that family. But Betty visited the search area several times to check in on their progress. She was kind of annoying to the tired, hard-working crews, because they'd drag their exhausted bodies with sunburns and bug bites to shore, and then they'd see this cool, freshly dressed Betty, acting like she didn't have a care in the world. The smile ever present on her face seemed really out of place, She seemed unconcerned and insincere, so some serious questions were coming up. The water wasn't cold, so unless Jimmy Don's body was weighed down, the gases expanding the body should have brought him to the surface. So it started to become the universal opinion that if Jimmy Don was found, he wouldn't be found in that lake. It was really beginning to look like a setup. The broken motor and the spilled pills, the prescription pills were over 2 years old. As the official search wound down, there had been over 3,000 man-hours put into looking for Jimmy Don's body. And after 13 days, the official search ended, but people who loved him continued searching. They really couldn't get him off of their minds. Whenever people were out on the lake, their thoughts would turn to Jimmy Don, and some of them continued to be hopeful that he would be found and he would be okay. But things seemed easier for Betty than for these other people. 2 days after she reported her husband missing, she walked right into a funeral home, chose a white casket lined with blue satin, and then picked out a cemetery plot. The next week, she asked that a memorial service be held for her late husband, and his family refused. He wasn't dead to them. They didn't know. They were still looking for his body. And she's just moving right along.
Well, she's got an agenda.
She does, and they knew it.
Jamie Beets' aunt woke him on the morning after his father's empty boat was found. Jamie rushed to Cedar Creek to search. The Coast Guard took him to see his father's boat, and what he saw shocked him. My dad wasn't on his boat, Jamie insisted. None of Jimmy Don's habits had been followed. He never would have gone out without his CB radio, for one thing. And yes, he'd had a heart attack 5 years ago, but he hadn't used nitro pills in 2 years. Jamie said he's somewhere else, and I bet Betty knows where he is. You just go round up Betty and make her tell you what happened to Dad.
Yeah, so Jimmy Don's family was on to her right away. A couple of days later, Jamie heard that Betty had gone out to the fire department to pick up Jimmy Don's final paycheck. So Jamie made an appointment with Reed Canton, a lawyer in Gun Barrel City, who had used his own airplane to search for Jimmy Don. He wanted the lawyer to tie up his father's assets to keep them out of Betty's hands until they could figure out what had really happened to his father. Jamie also discussed his concerns with law enforcement and his wife and other members of his family. But no one took him completely seriously. Devastated by the news that 7 years would go by before she could collect anything from murdering Jimmy Don, Betty started laying claim to his property. Jimmy Don's father began driving by his son's Glen Oaks neighborhood. He stopped if he saw any neighbors in their yards, and one neighbor, Burton, immediately went to Beets' open window and shared his condolences. But Jimmy Don's dad said it was the way he lost his son that bothered him the most. "My boy ain't in that lake," he said. "She's killed him and put him somewhere." Now it seemed like everyone had a theory about what had happened to Jimmy Don. Months after his disappearance, his name would still come up daily in the local cafes and bars. Everyone seemed to know that he needed his glasses only for reading, so he never took them out on the boat. And also, he didn't normally fish in the dark. So some people speculated that maybe Betty's former husband, Wayne, had returned and he had killed Jimmy Don.
Well, not likely.
No, but they don't know where he is,
Right.
And no one had heard from him in 2 years. Betty told the sheriff that she's never heard from Wayne, and she also said that none of her male friends would be jealous enough to kill Jimmy Don. And she was just as confused about his disappearance as anyone. She didn't know what had happened.
Betty had pretty much taken over Jimmy Don's house, where Jamie and his family used to live. The next time he returned to the Glen Oaks house, Jamie found his belongings in the backyard. The Glen Oaks neighbors banded together against Betty and called Jamie to report on Betty's activities around the house. Betty brought people over to look at the house, and it looked like she was trying to sell it. When Jamie heard about this, he called around and learned the name of her realtor, who told him that Betty had listed the house for sale. So Jamie filed a restraining order against Betty, and the order prevented her from selling any property belonging to Jimmy Don, and the house came off the market. Jamie is still determined to prove that Betty was behind his father's disappearance.
Yeah, but undeterred by Jamie's restraining order not to sell any of Jimmy Don's property, almost 1 year after Jimmy Don's disappearance, Betty faked a power of attorney form and put her name on it as having full power over all of Jimmy Don's possessions. And using this fake document, she sold his boat for a little over $3,000. Jimmy Don's former neighbor, J.R. Burton, hated Betty. He couldn't help but watch from his front window whenever she visited the house across the street. One early fall day in 1984, he looked out of his window and he saw Betty drive up. Through a heavy mist off of the lake, he saw Betty bend down by the large outdoor mounted air conditioning unit. She appeared to be doing something with the bolts that secured the unit to its base. Then she threw her tools into a box and picked up the unit and loaded it into her truck. Now he was just amazed by her physical strength. She wasn't a large woman.
I'm amazed too.
Yeah. And the next day, the weather had cleared up and Betty came back. Burton watched her walk quickly to the house, and she was carrying a large box from her truck. She stayed inside for just about 15 minutes. Then coming out empty-handed, she returned to her truck and she drove away. But after she reached the top of the hill, she pulled over by some trees and parked. Burton just stood there, confused about what she was up to. But then, in just minutes, he saw black smoke come up from the back of the house, and he called the fire department. 4 of the neighbors rushed across the street. The fire was out of control within minutes. The sirens of approaching fire engines came as a relief, but Betty was still parked nearby, watching this happen. After the fire was out, firefighters saw that the back of the house had burned away, and near the patio door, they found an oil can sitting in a rocking chair. Also, there were spent matches strewn about on the blackened patio concrete. The fire had started in the back bedroom. Someone had obviously piled papers and documents on top of the bed, then poured diesel fuel over it. Burton knew he had to report that he'd seen Betty, but then when he looked up the hill to point her out, she'd already left.
Gerald Albright was a married man who knew Betty from the Cedar Club. Now, one night, when they were both out drinking, their normal flirtations crossed a line, and they met up at a local motel to have sex. In addition to the sex, they shared a large amount of alcohol, and as they were rolling around on the bed, a very drunk Betty said to him, "Here we are fucking and having so much fun. You wouldn't think it was so funny if you knew that one guy I fucked is buried in my front yard."
Wow.
Yeah, but if they were drunk enough, he probably didn't even remember.
Oh, he remembered. But Betty wasn't able to collect the homeowner's insurance after the fire. She was told that the fire was still being investigated. Then after consulting with an attorney, Betty filed for Jimmy Don's death certificate in February of 1985. In front of the judge, Betty explained that her husband had died without a will. She testified that the people closest to him would normally see him every day, but that after August 6, 1983, no one had had any further contact with him. Betty asserted that she was his legal spouse and entitled to inherit his entire estate. She told the judge she had debts to pay. 3 weeks later, Betty happily returned to court and signed the papers to become the administrator of Jimmy Don's estate. The court officially decided that Jimmy Don Beets had died on August 6, 1983, and Betty could now inherit thousands of dollars in insurance, pensions, and property.
So a man named Ron Becker was arrested for marijuana possession. He told police that he had information on who had killed Jimmy Don Beets. His friend, Gerald Albright, had told him that she had confessed to him during a hookup at a local motel. Betty had killed Jimmy Don and buried him in a wishing well in her yard. The police obviously made him take a polygraph, and he passed.
He did, and he'd been an informant for the police before, but usually on drug things, not on murders. So at 8 every morning, Gerald Albright could be found having coffee at McLean's, a homey restaurant known for having big breakfasts. The place wouldn't take credit cards, but accepted a personal check. So that gives you the idea of the kind of place it was. A detective went inside and waited for Gerald to finish his coffee, and then he followed him outside. He caught up with him in the middle of the block where there was less pedestrian traffic to overhear their conversation, and he asked Gerald Albright about what Ron Becker had told the police about Betty Lou Beets. Gerald admitted to what Betty had said to him, and then he added, "That woman scares me to death."
I guess she sends out a good vibe, huh? So Officer Diaz-Ortega of the Dallas Police Department took a message from Crime Stoppers from a friend of Betty's daughter, Phyllis. According to Phyllis, Shirley had told her that her mother had killed 2 of her husbands and buried them in her yard. Now, no one in law enforcement had really considered that Betty could be responsible for the disappearance of her husband, Wayne. Everyone believed Betty when she said that Wayne had left on his own. So there had been no investigation, and there was no one asking investigators to look into Wayne's disappearance, not even his family. The Black Widow killer is considered one of the hardest of all to detect because she quietly lays meticulous plans and then acts at home.
Yeah, and we've covered several of these.
We have.
And I don't know if they're the hardest of all to detect. I would think that a killing by a stranger with no known motive might be the most difficult. But as far as someone killing people in their family or people they know, the Black Widow killer is just one of the most manipulative people. Without emotion, they target people close to them, usually a spouse or a child, and kill them for profit. And this was Betty. So by June 8th of 1985, the police had enough evidence to arrest Betty Lou Beets for Jimmy Don's murder. So it was 8:15 a.m., outside of Mansfield, Texas, when the police dispatcher sent out an urgent message for all officers in the area to be on the lookout for Betty Lou Beets, who was driving Jimmy Don Beets' pickup. 2 Mansfield police officers moved their squad cars so they had a full view of the road. Other officers in the area headed to the same location, and in less than 10 minutes, the red and white truck passed below them, and 3 Mansfield police cars with flashing lights caught up with the truck, and they surrounded it. The officers motioned to the driver to pull over to the side of the road, and it was Betty's latest boyfriend named Ray Bone who was driving, and he opened the driver's door. Once Ray Bone and Betty stood outside with their hands raised, 2 officers put handcuffs on both of them. An officer took out his printed card and read the Miranda warning. But before the officer could complete the first line, Betty blurted out, "Now this couldn't have anything to do with my husband's drowning, could it?" I don't know if she talked that way, but that's the way it seems to me.
Playing the innocent one.
Right.
One officer checked with the dispatcher and learned that they didn't need to arrest Ray Bone, so they unlocked his handcuffs. Betty turned her truck over to Ray. This is the truck that had once belonged to Jimmy Don. Ray hugged her before an officer pulled her away and put her into the squad car. Betty was taken to the Mansfield Police Department jail, where she was booked. Before being put in a holding cell, a judge set her bond at $100,000. Once the Mansfield police notified the sheriff's office that Betty had been locked up, arrangements were made to bring Betty back to Henderson County.
Yeah, so once they were back at the Henderson County Jail, Betty was asked if she would come along to her property and help them search for the bodies of Jimmy Don and Wayne. Now she seemed shocked to hear that they knew anything about Wayne, and she refused to go with them and asked for an attorney. But this wouldn't stop her downward spiral. Jimmy Don's body was found just a couple of feet under the soil in the wishing well planter. Betty had planted flowers over him. After further excavation, Wayne Barker's body was recovered from about 4 feet into the ground. He was decomposed to mostly just a skeleton. But they would find out that both husbands had been shot with the same pistol. So after both victims were in body bags, deputies took them to a waiting ambulance which would transport them to the medical examiner. A crowd had gathered, and they broke up to allow the ambulance to get on the highway back to Dallas. Reporters were in the street asking questions of neighbors and trying to find people who would admit to knowing Betty Lou Beets. The residents of the Cedar Creek community were relieved when reporters told them that Betty had been arrested. One woman told them that she had forced her son to take karate lessons to protect himself from Betty's family. Mrs. Rosenberg, who lived down the street, said that each time she'd walked her dog by, he tried to get over to that well, so he had definitely smelled something that she couldn't. Betty's daughter Shirley had just returned from her honeymoon the day after her mother's arrest. A sheriff's deputy knocked on her front door that Sunday morning and asked to speak with Shirley alone. So she knew this was not good. Shirley was then arrested for the 2 murders as well.
And Betty's children, Robbie and Shirley, testified against her, but they also admitted that they had some involvement in covering up the murders. Betty pleaded not guilty, and she claimed that her children alone were guilty of the murders.
So
Lovely.
What kind of a mother?
Lovely,
Just
lovely.
throwing the kids under the bus. Yeah.
Betty was found guilty of the murder of Jimmy Don Beets, and she was sentenced to death. And because she had already received the death penalty, she was never tried for the murder of Wayne Barker.
So this case attracted national and international attention because of the things that came out, never presented by her original trial lawyer, that Betty had suffered physical, sexual, and emotional abuse both as a child and from her husbands. But the husbands she killed, I think, were the nice ones, right? Wasn't it Wayne and Jimmy Don who never beat her? I guess there was a question about Wayne. She said he beat her, but no one had seen it. That was just her saying it, right?
Right.
And then Jimmy Don, she wasn't even claiming that he beat her.
No.
She just said that, if she doesn't kill him, he might one day. He eventually would, or something like that, right? So that's pretty crazy. Now, her attorneys would argue that because she had inadequate defense counsel at her 1985 trial, the jury was never able to consider the mitigating circumstances during her sentencing phase. The attorneys also charged that the state parole board violated her civil rights by denying her the review process that the state legislature mandates for all murder cases that involved battered women. But the battered women thing never really came up, and that was probably a mistake by her attorney. Still, it didn't help her.
No, it didn't. So Betty's execution was set for February 24th, 2000. About 100 protesters, some holding photos of a bruised Betty following a beating, gathered outside the prison before her execution. Death penalty opponents, domestic violence awareness organizations, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and even people from the UN Human Rights Commission had appealed to Texas Governor George W. Bush to commute her sentence. According to the governor's office, Bush received more than 2,000 calls and letters from people opposing the execution, while only 57 messages came from those endorsing it. Betty was executed that evening at 6:08 p.m. by lethal injection. She didn't ask for a final meal, and she had no last words.
So there's really no question that Betty was guilty. She did shoot and kill Jimmy Don Beets. But should she have been given the death penalty? That's the question in my mind. And death penalty opponents would argue that she'd been abused, and therefore that was a mitigating circumstance. But Betty also had a history of violence herself. She'd shot one husband, remember Billy Lane, and then she'd gone on to kill 2 others. Also against her was that she'd planned out the murders, so they were both premeditated. And she had told her children about it, and she had prepared where she would hide the bodies and what she would tell people before the killings. And from killing both of these men, she stood to inherit money and property. Now also, when she committed the murders, she wasn't in any danger of the men, and she showed no remorse. And then she even tried to blame the murders on her own children. To me, that's very low. That's a black mark.
That sure is. One worrying thing about Betty's conviction is that her sexual activities with men were used to show she was of poor character. Her conviction for lewdness, back when she tried to be a stripper, was also used against her by prosecutors.
Yeah, so that's not really right. That shouldn't have happened, I think. Well, the judge allowed it in, so I guess it should have happened, but it doesn't seem right to me.
During her appeals, experts said that Betty had severe learning disabilities, post-traumatic stress disorder, and battered woman syndrome. Her defense attorney never brought up her abuse as a defense or as a mitigating factor.
Right, which may have helped her out, at least in the sentencing phase. I think she still would have been found guilty, but maybe if they knew some of the horrors she'd experienced, and I believe that she did. I don't think she had an easy life by any means. Maybe she wouldn't have gotten the death penalty. I mean, if you're pro-death penalty, it's pretty easy to see why she would deserve it. But the childhood issues, the hearing loss, the brain injury, and the history of abuse do seem like adequate mitigating factors to give her life in prison. But still, I guess Betty made her own bed.
Yeah, the murders she committed were brutal, cruel, premeditated, and cold-blooded. And her behavior afterwards, such as starting a fire and falsifying documents, didn't help either.
No, that didn't go over well.
She never alleged to be in danger, but she did want to benefit financially. A good example of how one person can be a perpetrator and a victim at the same time.
I would think so. I think with Betty both could be true. She was a violent, dangerous killer, but she was also a target of crimes throughout most of her life. So I think even if she found that nice husband, Jimmy Don Beets, even if he was perfect, she was already so damaged she wouldn't know how to live that way.
Yeah.
So I think that being a killer and being a victim are directly related with her. So should we really be killing people like Betty is the question. The vast majority of the 3,600 inmates on death row do come from impoverished and abused backgrounds, and they lack the resources for an adequate defense.
Well, I'm not a death penalty advocate, so I think that life without parole would be good. The majority of adults who are physically or psychologically abused as kids come out okay.
Yeah, I guess that's true. I don't know. I hear that's true.
Well, I'll say more or less.
More or less okay. They function okay.
Yeah.
I think they probably have some difficulties emotionally, but it doesn't turn them into monsters.
Doesn't turn them into killers.
Right.
And the whole thing from the beginning was premeditated.
It was. But then what about her defense counsel? If she was a wealthy woman and hired some expensive attorneys, I feel like she probably wouldn't have got the death penalty.
Maybe.
And it is Texas. They do like the death penalty there. They use it. So, hard to say, but Betty's not someone that you would want to cross.
Definitely not.
No. Okay, so this is the time of the show where we ask for your feedback, your support, and your positive reviews. You can share your opinions and your case suggestions with us by email to truecrimebrewery@tiegrabber.com or by leaving a voicemail by clicking on Leave a Voicemail in our show notes or on our website, tiegrabber.com. And maybe we'll play your voicemail on a future show. And if you're interested in listening to your TCB episodes without interruptions or advertisements, you can subscribe by going to tiegrabber.com/subscribe. Or you can get the same benefits by supporting us on our Patreon at patreon.com/tiegrabber. Our subscribers are very important to us, and once you subscribe, you'll get all of our episodes early and ad-free, plus a bonus episode every month. Plus, we'll send you a gift and some swag along with a handwritten thank you note. So thanks for listening, and we're going to move on now to feedback.
It's time for listener feedback.
Let's do feedback.
Okay, so we're going to play a voicemail from Elizabeth with the case suggestion.
Hi, Dick and Jill. It's Elizabeth from Ottawa. I know it's early, but I wanted to suggest a case for Christmas time. It's the story of Willie Thomas Soak. The movie Bad Santa was based on him, and it's actually very comical. Unfortunately, it does include a murder, but I thought you might be interested in sharing the true story with your listeners. Thank you.
All right. Direct and to the point, Elizabeth. I like that. And I think that could be fun. I hate to say fun if there was a murder, but it could be a good thing for Christmas. It's always good at the holidays if you can find a murder that happened around that time and discuss it. Makes it a little more relatable.
I never realized that Bad Santa there was based on a true story.
Well, no, I don't think most of us did know that.
So I thought that might be interesting to see what's going on with that.
Yeah, definitely. It's a great case suggestion. Okay, why don't you read our first email?
This is from Lucia, or Lucia.
Okay.
I don't know how she pronounces it. And she says, I'm not sure if you've ever heard of or covered the case of the Claremont serial killings, which took place in my hometown of Perth, Western Australia. And if you've never heard of them, it might be worth a look.
Yeah, I was thinking we haven't done an Australian case in a bit.
Well, this case involved the disappearance of 3 young women from a wealthy suburb in Perth. They remained unsolved for almost 2.5 decades, until 2020, and has been described as one of the longest and most expensive cases in the state's history. Having been in my early 20s at the time of the disappearances, I can vividly recall the atmosphere of fear associated with leaving night spots in the area. It was such a foreign feeling. Perth is located on the west coast of Australia on the Indian Ocean and is one of the most isolated cities in the world. It's also very beautiful.
It is beautiful. I've only seen pictures. That's one place I really want to travel to.
Yes.
So the summary of this story is between January of 1996 and March of 1997, 3 young women disappeared from a popular night spot in Claremont. That's a suburb of Perth, like Lucia said. 2 bodies were found and 1 has never been found. So the investigation continued for 10 years until Bradley Robert Edwards was arrested in December of 2016. He was charged with the murders and found guilty of 2 of them. So the woman whose body was never discovered earned a not guilty verdict. Still, Edwards was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole before 40 years. So I think this could be really an interesting one to do. I think that's a good suggestion as well. Okay, we shouldn't give too much away. Sometimes we do that.
I know, so.
Okay, one more email, and this is a case suggestion from Cindy C., and Cindy writes, going along with Rebecca and Aaron's voicemail, and this was a couple months ago, I looked. So she's talking about a voicemail that happened quite a while back. I would like very much for you to do the Todd Mullis case. I'm also anxious for you to do the Taylor Parker case. Rebecca's suggestion on the podcast. So Todd Mullis was an Iowa pig farmer convicted of killing his wife with a corn rake after finding out she was having an affair. He tried to play this off as a freak accident, but the autopsy showed that she had been punctured with the rake twice. So...
It makes it tough to be an accident.
Right. So this sounds like quite a story. Apparently there had been marital problems for quite a while. So that's worth looking into. Now the Taylor Parker case, which has been recommended a few times. Taylor Parker had 2 children with her first husband, but then she had to have a hysterectomy. And after divorcing that husband, Taylor married Hunter Parker. But she didn't tell him that she couldn't conceive. 2 of Taylor's friends said that she offered them $100,000 to act as surrogates, but they turned her down. Taylor reportedly told people that she and Hunter had hired a surrogate, but then Hunter had cheated on her with the surrogate they'd hired. So I don't know if that's true, but that's kind of funny. So Hunter and Taylor separated in 2019, and then weeks later, she started dating Wade Griffin, and she was really determined to hang on to him. So this is when she decided she'd fake a pregnancy. She even had a gender reveal party, saying that she was expecting a daughter. And when this was investigated, detectives said her online searches really escalated, seeking places where pregnant women were and watching videos of C-sections, so possibly learning how to do a C-section. There were even some workers at a clinic that testified that Taylor started crying after she came in for a sonogram and told them she'd have to reschedule because her military husband had just passed away. But after that, Taylor actually sat in the parking lot and she looked up license plates of expectant moms as they came for their appointments. So she'd started searching for a victim, and she knew that Reagan Michelle Hancock was pregnant with a daughter. She'd actually photographed Reagan and her husband's wedding in 2019, and they'd kept in touch on social media. So what Taylor did is she reached out to Reagan, and they bonded over their pregnancies, even though Taylor's was fake. Reagan's husband said he tried unsuccessfully to contact Reagan after receiving some strange messages from her phone. And then he asked Reagan's mom to check on her, and she found Reagan murdered. So the evidence and the testimony revealed that Reagan was beaten and stabbed in several areas of the home, and she died in the living room. She had defensive wounds, so she'd fought for herself and her baby. She had a broken nose, 5 skull fractures, and more than 100 stab wounds, so this was brutal.
I guess.
Reagan's killer had sliced her lower abdomen from hip to hip, removing her onboard child and the placenta. Now, I'm not going to tell you how she got caught, because it's very interesting, and I think we're going to do an episode on it. So, Quite a story.
Yeah.
So I think we have some great suggestions from some great listeners, and we appreciate it very much.
Those are excellent.
They are. So thank you, everyone, for spending this time with us at the Quiet Act. We'll see you next time.
We'll save some seats for you. Come on down.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.